Every year you pay tax. It comes out before you even see your paycheck. You don't hand it over. You don't write a check. It's just gone, skimmed off the top before the money ever touches your hands. Like a toll booth you never agreed to drive through. You work, you earn, they take a slice. That's the deal. That's just how it works. Except, it's not how it works. Not for everyone. Because there is a small group of people at the very top who barely pay any tax at all. And I don't mean they pay a little less than you. I mean some of the richest people on the entire planet have had years where they paid less tax than a school teacher, than a waiter, than you. And here's the part that's going to bother you. They're not cheating. There's no shady offshore island, no secret vault under a volcano, no briefcase of cash being handed to a man named Dimitri. It's all completely, boringly legal. It has an actual name. And once you understand it, I promise you will start seeing it absolutely everywhere. So let me show you exactly how it works, step by step. And to do that, I want you to meet Bob. Bob is rich. Not nice house, 2 cars rich. Bob owns a company, and Bob's shares in that company are worth $1 billion. Now here's the very first thing nobody ever tells you about people like Bob. Bob is a billionaire, but Bob has almost no money, no cash, nothing in the account. His $1 billion isn't sitting in a bank somewhere with his name on it. It's locked up inside those company shares. On paper, Bob is worth $1 billion. In his actual wallet, right now, Bob might genuinely have less cash than you do. He might have to check his couch cushions to pay for parking. This sounds like a problem. It is not a problem. It is the entire trick. But to understand why, we have to ask the obvious question. How does Bob buy things? Because Bob wants stuff. Bob wants a yacht. Bob wants a mansion. Bob wants a second, slightly larger yacht, purely so he has something to look at while he's standing on the first yacht. This is just how it goes once you pass a certain amount of money. Your problems stop being real and start being nautical. So how does a man with no cash buy a giant boat? Well, here's the obvious answer, the one you or I would do. Bob sells some shares. He owns $1 billion of them. He just sells a slice, takes the cash, and buys his stupid boat. Easy. And that right there is the exact thing Bob will never, ever do. Because the moment Bob sells those shares, the government wakes up. Selling shares for a profit is what's called a taxable event. It's the system's tripwire. The instant Bob sells, he's officially made money, and a huge chunk of that money gets taken in tax. Sell $100 million of stock, and depending on where Bob lives, he could hand over 20, 30, even 40 million of it to the taxman. Just like that, gone. Bob looks at that. Bob thinks about handing $40 million to the government so he can buy a boat. And Bob would genuinely rather eat the boat, plank by plank, with a knife and fork. So Bob does not sell. Selling is for people like us. Bob has a better idea. Bob walks into a bank, and Bob says, "Hello, I own $1 billion worth of shares. I would like to borrow some money, and I'd like to use my shares as the thing that guarantees I'll pay you back." And the bank basically falls in love, because to a bank, Bob is the single safest human being who has ever walked through the door. Think about it. Most people who want a loan are a risk. They might lose their job. They might not pay it back. But Bob has $1 billion of assets just sitting there, backing him up. If Bob somehow doesn't pay, the bank just takes some shares. There is almost zero risk. So the bank rolls out the red carpet. They give Bob a giant loan, and because he's so safe, they give it to him at a tiny, tiny interest rate. A rate you and I will never be offered in our lives. Bob borrows, let's say, $10 million, and he doesn't sell a single share to do it. The shares stay exactly where they are. Still his, still growing. He just borrowed against them. And now we arrive at the beautiful part. The part that should make your eye twitch. A loan is not income. You do not pay tax on a loan. Think about it. Why would you? It's not money you earned. It's money you have to give back. When you borrow money, the government doesn't count that as you getting richer, because technically, you now owe it. So when Bob borrows $10 million against his shares, the government looks at Bob's income for the year and sees nothing. Zero. As far as the tax system is concerned, Bob didn't earn a thing. Bob now has $10 million in cash. Bob has bought the yacht. Bob is standing on the yacht. And on paper, for tax purposes, Bob had a year so financially quiet, he might as well have been asleep. Bob is living like a king and paying tax like a man who is, technically, unemployed. Now, I know what you're thinking. I can hear it. You're thinking, okay, hold on. It's a loan. He has to pay it back. And paying it back costs money, and that money has to come from somewhere. And somewhere along the line, surely, it gets taxed, right? That's a great question. A smart question. You're thinking like a normal, responsible person. And that, my friend, is exactly your problem. Because Bob is not planning to pay it back the way you'd pay back a loan. You think of debt as a weight, a thing you carry, a thing you stress about, a thing you want gone. Bob does not think about debt like that at all. To Bob, debt is just a tool, a lever. And here's why it works for him and not for you. Bob's shares are growing. Remember, his $1 billion of stock isn't frozen. Good companies grow in value over time. So Bob's billion quietly becomes 1.1 billion, then 1.2. And here's the magic. His shares are growing faster than the tiny interest on his loan. The pile he's borrowing against is getting bigger faster than the debt is. So Bob can just keep going. Next year he needs more money, he borrows a little more against his now even bigger pile. And the year after that, a little more. He never has to sell. He never has to earn. He never triggers the tripwire. He just keeps borrowing against a number that keeps going up. Buy the assets, borrow against them instead of selling, and then do it again and again and again. This is so common, so established, that it actually has a name. Quietly, in the world of the very wealthy, this strategy is called buy, borrow, die. And yeah, I know, we need to talk about that third word. But before we get to the dying, because trust me, it's the best part, let me show you that this isn't some made-up cartoon with a guy called Bob. You have heard of the founders of the giant companies, the ones whose names are on the rockets and the packages and the websites. A lot of them famously take a salary of $1 a year. $1. And everyone goes, wow, what a humble, generous hero, working for a single dollar. That's not humility, that's the trick. A salary gets taxed, so they don't take one. Instead, they hold billions in company stock, and when they need money, they borrow against that stock. The same move as Bob. They are living off loans secured against shares they never sell, which means there's barely any income to tax. Okay, now, the dying. Eventually, Bob dies. I know. Dark turn. I felt it too. But stick with me because this is where the trick stops being clever and starts being genuinely unbelievable. When Bob dies, he's got two things. He's got that giant pile of shares, now worth way more than $1 billion, and he's got the debt, all those loans he took out over the years. So here's what happens. Bob's shares pass to his kids. And in a lot of countries, when you inherit assets like that, there's a quiet little rule with an extremely boring name. They call it a step up in basis. And they made it boring on purpose so you'd never look into it. Here's what that boring rule does. All that growth, the entire increase in value from when Bob first bought the shares to the day he died, the gains that should have been taxed at some point, gets wiped clean, reset to zero. The kids inherit the shares fresh with the tax counter set back to zero, and that enormous mountain of gains that dodged tax Bob's entire life now dodges it forever. Let that sink in. Bob spent his whole life spending money he never paid income tax on. And then, on his way out the door, he made sure nobody would ever pay tax on the gains either. And here's the part that should actually get under your skin. You can't do this. Not you shouldn't, you can't. This entire strategy only works if you already have a giant pile of assets to borrow against in the first place. It's a machine that only turns on once you're already rich. Look at the difference. If your wealth is your paycheck, if you trade your hours for money like most of the planet, you get taxed first, before you see a cent. The toll booth comes before the road. But if your wealth is $1 billion of stock, you flip the whole thing around. You borrow, you spend, you live, and the tax just never really comes. You and Bob are not playing the same game. You're playing a game where you pay first and live on whatever's left. Bob's playing a game where he lives first, spends freely, and pays almost nothing, ever. Same country, same laws, two completely different rule books, and only one of them was ever handed to you. So if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right, working hard, paying what you owe, following every rule, and still somehow falling behind while people at the top glide further and further ahead, you're not imagining. You're not bad with money. You're not lazy. You're just playing the version of the game where the rules cost you, while a small group at the top plays the version where the rules pay them. The difference was never how hard you worked. It was which rulebook you were handed at birth. But here's the one thing they can't take back now. You know the trick. You can see the machine. And once you've seen it, you can never unsee it in the headlines, in the $1 salaries, in the billionaires who somehow earn nothing. Buy, borrow, die. I'm George Washington. They put my face on the money, and now you know who it's really for. Sleep well.